This year is just flying by, and we're starting in Chapter 4. We're in Section 1. Stuff that we've kind of talked about before, but this is kind of a more formalized section talking about the immigrants that are coming to America. This section is looking specifically at the section from 1865 to 1896, but we're also going to have some crossover to the early 1900s just because of the way the timetable goes through. The first thing we need to know is when we're talking about immigrants, the first thing we had the old immigrants. And these old immigrants were mostly before the 1890s, and what they were, they all looked the same. They all acted in a very similar way. They were mostly Protestants from Northern Europe. The United States culture at that time reflected traditions and the beliefs of Northern Europe, so it made it was an easier process for immigrants to come in and find their home and their spot or their place in our society. They were able to acclimate themselves quicker. It was still with a lot of struggles, but what you're going to see now during this period of time is there's going to be a new generation of immigrants. The new immigrants that we're going to see are the Southern and Eastern European immigrants, so like the lower Slavic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, the southern states of Europe. There was also Jews and lots of Catholics, and they were unskilled. And most of them decide to settle in cities. Now, this is a recurring theme that we'll talk about again is, well, why did they come? First of all, there's going to be push factors and pull factors, which we talked about in earlier chapters. Push factors, of course, are things that cause people to want to leave a country or push them out. The examples could be religious persecution, war, poor and unstable economy. The other thing is pull factors, things that would attract the people to move to a place or pulls them in. In the United States, we're talking about land, employment, religion, or political freedom. The Homestead Act of 1862, which we've talked about before, it made Western farmland inexpensive, and the railroads offered assistance with fares. They could have need customers in the West who would buy their goods. So many Norwegians and Germans settled in the new Western territories to farm. They did things that they were comfortable with, and the United States offered that opportunity because of a very diverse climate. Especially with the lower cost, these new immigrants who didn't have much had a chance to be able to settle in and be able to be good at something. So who were they? The crowded steerage decks usually contain a diverse group of people. Many of them were poor farmers whose fathers and grandfathers' land had been divided so often that the plots were no longer large enough to support even small single families. Others were schoolmasters unable to find work or artisans looking for greater opportunities. Many were young men and women willing to risk traveling to an unknown land in hopes of finding a better future. I think the picture on the right really kind of exemplifies that, like looking in the background, seeing the Statue of Liberty. It's a little foggy, obviously, but that's the whole idea of we don't really know what we're going to get. We might have it great. We might really struggle, but is it worth that opportunity? And you'll see a lot of people decide to take that risk. So on the trip, I want you to think of the movie The Titanic, or the boat The Titanic. Many people traveled in poor conditions, and what we call it was steerage, lower quarters. These people became sick because of tight living quarters, and disease is going to spread easily. Now, I'm not trying to even come close to explaining this or comparing this to things that have happened in the past, like the slave trade, but what you have is a situation where the quarters are not up to health standards, and it's still a long journey. And again, these people are risking their lives. They're risking everything that they have to go there for the chance to gain that popular. It wasn't a guarantee. So in the arrival process, you had two major ports of entry. On the northern side, or the eastern side, on the north, you have Ellis Island, which was New York City. This is where most of the people from Europe arrived. And on the west coast in San Francisco, you're going to have Angel Island. And this is where most of the people come from Asia, and they're going to arrive. You can see on the map where it's there, obviously Angel Island there, with here being western Ellis Island, which we'll see on senior trip. In 1990, Congress designated a low-lying 3-acre Ellis Island in the upper New York Bay as an immigration station. And by the end of 1910, 6 million immigrants had come through the Ellis Island. Ellis Island is there. The Statue of Liberty is actually on Liberty Island, but kind of all that whole complex of hospitals and checking spots, which are just really interesting to see our history. Here's some imagery you see. This would be the hospital area, the station. These are going to be people in line waiting for their chance. Ellis Island. And then you see here these pictures of people coming in and being inspected for health conditions. So these immigration stations, once the immigrants arrived in the United States, they went through the stations such as Ellis Island and New York Harbor. Government workers questioned them about where they would plan to work and live. Doctors also examined them to make sure they didn't have any diseases. Almost all European immigrants were allowed to enter the United States initially. Now keep back in mind, and I'm going to go back to this, the whole idea is if people are coming through and being inspected by doctors, well, what happens if you got sick on the trip? Well, you're going to have to sit there. You're going to have to stay there for a long time. And what's going to happen in Ellis Island, they're going to build a whole hospital complex to make sure that the people who are coming through these immigration stations are actually healthy enough to enter the country. We didn't want to take in everybody. Long lines of waiting for immigrants were tagged accordingly to the language that they spoke, and they marked with chalk according to the medical ailments that they were suspected of having, and they waited for inspectors to decide their fate. Can they enter the country or can they not? With huge number of immigrants, inspectors just had 2 minutes to comply or complete the process, and many immigrants had their last name changed by inspectors because they didn't have the time or patience or struggle with that foreign spelling. It's amazing because what you see is a lot of people's family lineage changes at this point in time, and like places like Ellis Island now in the museum, you're able to look back and see, well, what came through and how did they come through. I know looking at my family in the past, like they had the last name was Super, and some were named Super and some were named Superiori, but that was just, again, looking at that translation, maybe having two different people who were looking or inspecting didn't have that ability. So even if they were related, it wasn't necessarily or necessity that they be given the same last name. Only 1/3 of the immigrants who came to the United States through Ellis Island stayed in New York City, most scattered across the country. Immigrants were given tags to pin their hats or coats. These tags showed the railroad conductor what line the immigrants were traveling and what connection to make to reach their destination. Now, I think this first part is really, really significant, especially if you've ever been to New York City. What you see when people are entering there, you have very ethnic neighborhoods, meaning that you have places like Little Italy, like Chinatown, and what you see is people who were there since the founding of the country, since this immigration standard, where they settled together in common groups, where they created their own little infrastructure. So they had their own stores and their own ability. They didn't really go to mainstream culture. They created a culture within the culture. That's why places like New York or Pittsburgh are very, very much culturally diverse, as opposed to places that are a little bit more rural, because in these areas, people purposefully would settle together. New immigrants arriving in Ellis Island. At Ellis Island, they were processed before they were allowed to continue on their journey to find their new home. So just again, a nice image to show you. This museum, this building right here is still intact, so we will see it on the senior trip. So that's how we're going to end section 1. Again, more of a review from what were happening to see what are the effects that are really changing the way our culture works, and how is this going to expand the country that we know and love already.